chapter 5. Actually, lesson 4, not 5. 5 would be after 4. We're talking about responsible and accountable. So we spent some time Wednesday night looking through this book. We kind of talked a little bit about responsibility and accountability. And what I want to do this morning is kind of slow down and make sure that we dig into this. So one thing I was thinking as I was putting this together is we don't have a specific list in Scripture that applies to the 21st century church. There's a lot of things that we do, and the way churches developed and evolved and grown over the years, that we don't have a specific list. Is that a member should show up 15 minutes early, should do this, should do that. We don't have a list of that. We don't have a list of, how to, prepare the emblems for the Lord's Supper. We don't have a specific list of, here's an evangelist's 21st century duty. Here's its duties of a shepherd in the 21st century. Here's what they're responsible and accountable for. We have some overall guidelines. We have some instruction and some principles. But down to the, I don't want to say checklist, but down to the detailed list. Because most of us that have jobs that are employed know what we're responsible for. When I show up to work, we know this is what I'm supposed to do all day long. This is exactly how I can serve the organization that I'm a part of. This is exactly how I can be successful. Here's how I can be a profitable worker in a job. And I wonder, would it be better for us as Christians, members, evangelists, elders, deacons, and teachers, if we have some practical list of what I should be doing? Because then we can identify what does that look like. So we talked, and I encouraged you on page 32, there's a big white space at the bottom. I encouraged you to kind of write out member, evangelist, teacher, elder, deacon, shepherd, and write down what are some specifics that they're accountable or responsible for. And so I want to talk about that a little bit today. But before we get there, I kind of liked question number 5. Is there any questions or thoughts you guys want to start out with? Or do we want to start where I want to focus? All right, we'll start where I want to start. All right, so question number 5. I kind of like this one. List reasons why a congregation does not hold members accountable for either their actions or inactions in their service to the Lord. Why don't we do that? Okay. Fear. We're afraid to. Why are we afraid to hold somebody accountable? It is. People will typically not respond favorably if I come to you and say, hey, I see error, I see a place in your life that you could do better. People tend to get defensive. Why else?
We worry about making people uncomfortable or maybe making them want to leave and find a different church. We're like, oh no, don't leave. They come back. We'll just play nice.
Be a little bit uncomfortable.
I think for the reason you said, and that is that most of us don't have a list of responsibilities. So, I mean, unless you were specifically given a task for which we're holding you accountable because it didn't get done, I mean, it's not like we can look at you and say, well, you're not doing this. So, I mean, we tend to do somewhat better, but still poorly, with people who are walking out of step, who are sinning. But as far as people who just aren't doing anything, it's hard to say no, the people aren't doing anything, because we're only here 4 hours a week. I don't see what you do the other however many hours we're not here. And so unless I know everything about what your life entails, I can't really look at you and say, well, you're not doing anything for the Lord all week, because I don't know that. And so I think that makes it difficult. And to answer your other question, yeah, in some ways I think it would be easier if we had a list of, this is what you should do. I mean, one of the things you said was arrive 15 minutes early. If we said you have to be here 15 minutes early, we probably might try a little harder at being 15 minutes early. Might be exactly 15 minutes early, but but
Might be 5 minutes.
well, maybe, but so
On both those points, if you got a individual list of, then it's a checklist mentality then. But yeah, again, we should not have that. And then also with the fear of, if we correct somebody, we're going to offend their relatives that are members here, and they're going to, again, they may leave and go somewhere else just because we have,
As far as why a congregation might not hold its members accountable, I suspect it's because we don't understand what authority the church has. I think we tend to be a body of individuals who say, I follow God, I believe the Bible, but the church doesn't tell me what to do. I decide what to do. And maybe we need to ask ourselves the question, how much authority does the church have in your life? And what can the church tell you to do? I don't know that I have a very clear understanding of that.
That kind of goes a little bit to what I said in the beginning. Wouldn't it be, the Bible doesn't give us a 21st century Church of Christ manual. It doesn't list out. So we have to take principles that are solid and rooted in spirituality and give them a God, and apply them to this adaptation, this evolution that we stand in called the 21st century church. Because it's not the same as the first century. But yes.
Yeah, the reason why a lot of times people don't correct others, I'll use a literal analogy. You take a sore on a dog's tail and start squeezing it, you get bit. And there's no way you can skin a cat and make him like it. So those things, that's one way to understand that. When we go through life, we're going to make somebody mad regardless. It's either man or God's going to be mad. Now, which one we want mad at us? It better not be God. We better do his will and help save our brother and save ourselves.
We saw in Revelation, the church to Laodicea said, you're neither hot nor cold. I wish that you were hot or cold, but you're lukewarm, and there's a lot of inactivity. But yeah, it's hard to instruct someone, encourage someone, and as we talked about in earlier chapters in here, exhort someone to love and good work. It is challenging because, as Andrew pointed out, what are the true roles, what are the activities, and what can we hold each other accountable for?
Had a conversation this week with Andrew, and I learned something about him I didn't know. He told me he knew every spot in our bedroom floor that caused the floor to squeak and how to go around those spots. And the reason he did that is because he was sneaking over to Mother's side of the bed to wake her without waking me. Now, put that in the context of what we're talking about. I think our fear is someone's going to take her head off. Someone's going to lash out and get angry. And it's just easier to avoid confrontation. But the family is responsible for setting that tone, not the bishops alone, not the deacons. The family sets that tone for how much tiptoeing goes on around in the household of God. And we should have less fear and more confidence in our step sometimes.
I was having a conversation with Emily last night. Angie went to bed and we're trying to get her dog to settle down. And as I was putting this together, I was making this list over about what are the activities of each person. And being a new person stepped into the shepherd role and trying to learn what am I supposed to do? What can I do? What activity? And I came up with this thought. And I'll share it with you. I shared it with Emily. So I asked her, I said, is this a good idea? Is it terrible? Is it scriptural or unscriptural? And again, let's face the fact. The 21st century model is not the same as the first century model. We are not a communal people. We don't all live and interact daily because of these boxes that we travel around in, these boxes that we live in, the wonderful thing called vehicles and airplanes that allows us to separate from each other and not have to be real close together. But I asked her, if you was at a congregation that the shepherds were really involved in your life, so much so that they met with you individually once a year and said, hey, how are you? Where are you in your faithful walk? What would you like to accomplish this year? And what talents do you want to develop? And they helped you develop a spiritual development plan that would help you to walk more uprightly, grow in the Lord, and be more active and faithful in the church. Well, on the surface, that all sounds scriptural. But how many people would it freak out? Because I've been in the Lord's church for 30 years. Never had that done. Would I have welcomed it? I don't know. I don't know if I would have or not. But is that something that a local church has the authority to do? Is that something that would be beneficial? Would that help members in congregations understand what are we accountable for, what are we responsible for? Because there's a lot of things that go on in the 21st century church that they didn't have to deal with. They didn't have to change light bulbs. They didn't have to pay parking lots. They didn't have to worry, do we have cushioned or uncushioned seats? How many pews do we have? Do we add pews? Do we take pews out? Do we change our assembly time? Do we do live stream? Do we have projectors? If we have to replace a projector, what projector do we get? None of these things, they didn't have to deal with none of this stuff. HVAC equipment, how do we heat and cool this building?
You're talking about a formalized plan, but I think the model that we see in the first century is those were things that came about naturally, organically. The elders were just as much a part of the individual lives of the congregation as, and vice versa, as as a family. And for us to put a plan, a framework and everything together for something that should be happening naturally, it seems kind of like overkill. It's but there are places where it's we've seen the separation, and it's what Roger Rochelle was talking about. There's not a separation between the leadership and the congregation. The leadership is the congregation, is part of the congregation. There's no hierarchy. The hierarchy is Christ is the head of the church, and that's it. So holding each other accountable, and we talk about, you can say, oh, let's make an organized plan and do this. That's got to come about naturally. It's got to come about because each individual cares for each other, and we know each other. That's the difference, I think.
So how do you feel the 21st century church does in general? Not just here, just in general.
I think we've allowed ourselves to get away from that because we think there is a hierarchy. I think we've we put the hierarchy in there, those of us who've grown up with it or been involved in it for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, whatever you want to say, have always understood the hierarchy to be there, as opposed to, the eldership being just on an even plane with the membership. Because we've got to move ourselves back away from that and just be, I've known Greg since I was 3 years old. So it doesn't mean that, I never considered him not, a leader. I mean, one of those unapproachable leader, because I've known him forever. So those are the kind of things where we need to, the eldership is to know their flock, if you would. That's the model we see.
The elders do have the responsibility to feed the flock and to know where they are spiritually, and if anybody's going astray, to bring them back. So I mean, I do think there are certain accountability things, and if we all knew our responsibility as Christians, the elders, we should make the elders work a whole lot easier. I mean, we'd all make our own individual plan of development instead of having somebody, kick us a little bit and say, okay, you need to step up a little bit more.
I think Dan's hit on an important point. I'm not sure he's not spot on. I think the reason why the 21st century church has done poorly at operating in more of an organic fashion is because he's right about this view of the church having this hierarchy. And so essentially members look at it as, well, if I had a responsibility to do that, the elders would tell me. And so it's like, because the elders haven't told me, I'm not accountable for that, so I don't need to do it. And so, I mean, I think there are other things that people do without the elders necessarily telling them. But I think that in some cases, there are people who are basically thinking, well, that's not my responsibility, or else the elders would tell me I need to be doing it. Or they would ask me to do it. I mean, however you want to put it. But the point is, I think Dan might be right. I think he might have hit on an important point. And it speaks to the need for us to reshape our thinking with regard to how the church is organized and the way in which it functions. And I mean, Chuck's right. Elders are responsible for shepherding the flock and watching out for souls. But Galatians 6:1-2, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of meekness and humility, applies to all of us. So the reality is, whether I'm a shepherd or not, if I see somebody who is in the church who's sinning, it's my responsibility to go to them and talk to them about it and try to help lead them back to the Lord. So elders have an important function, but the reality is, if I see it, regardless of who I am, that's my role.
When Roger was here, we talked about everybody on the even playing field, and that's really the way it should be. But even everybody that's even, there are different roles, different responsibilities. Yeah.
Other than relating to marriage, children, a few things, is there anything that an elder is responsible for, other than shepherding the flock, and that every member is not responsible for?
Is there anything? Is there anything that a shepherd's responsible for that every one of us are not responsible for? Other than directing the lead. I mean, if you take the concept of a shepherd, and so they have a flock of sheep, they help determine, we're going to this pasture, we're on this direction. They have a responsibility to oversee and make sure that, in the Old Testament times, make sure that none of the sheep wandered off. And then when they did, the shepherd went and found the sheep. He didn't say, okay, well, you 3 sheep go find that sheep. he went and did that. And I think we can apply that principle to the first century church. I think we're all 100%. I don't think any one role, if a member of this church says, I do not feel I have the talents to teach, to be an evangelist, to stand up and present lessons. I don't have the skills and necessary, I won't say confidence, but the necessary, and I don't want to say check marks, that's even worse, the necessary role, talents to be a deacon or a shepherd. I don't want them to say, okay, well, I don't have any person. We look at Corinthians, where it talks about being part of a body. The body is full of a bunch of different members, and they all serve different functions. Some of them are less glorious than others. Some of them we look at and think, man, I would hate to lose this. If you had to sacrifice a part of your body, we all have that one part that we would say, okay, if I have to give up something, I would give up this. Until you found somebody that didn't have that, and they would tell you why that's a necessary part of your body. Here's the difficulty that comes with losing that member, that part of your body.
I was hesitating to answer, but in answer to Margaret's question, I would say unless you consider able to teach to be publicly teaching, then no. From an individual perspective, there is no responsibility that belongs to a shepherd that is not something all of us as Christians should not be growing to do. That's what was my point with Galatians 6. If I see somebody who's sinning, whether I'm a shepherd or not, it's my responsibility as someone who is spiritually minded to try to help lead them back to the Lord. But in a collective sense, there is some difference in that when decisions have to be made that involve the collective, times of assembling, who to hire as an evangelist, some of those kinds of things are things that ultimately the shepherds have to decide. Now, they ought to decide it with input from the congregation, but in the end, it's not a democracy any more than my house is. And there are 7 people in my house, and when a decision has to be made that affects the entire household, we don't sit down as a family and say, okay, everybody take a vote, and whatever the majority decides is what we go with. I mean, we do try to talk about it as a family and get everybody's input, and then Ashley and I pray about it and talk about it, but ultimately, in my household, the decision falls to me. I would be unwise to make those decisions solitarily without any input or without any thought about how it affects all of the people in my house, just as elders would be unwise to just make a decision on the basis of what they want instead of what the congregation needs. But ultimately, in my house, the responsibility falls to me. And collectively, with decisions that affect the collective, the decision falls to the elders. And I mean, that's the only distinguishing thing. And it doesn't fall to the elders because they're superior. It falls to the elders because they've been appointed to the task, and somebody has to do it. And I mean, same thing in the household. The task falls to the husband because that's what God said. So somebody's got to do it. It doesn't mean I always like it, but it's my responsibility, and I will be held accountable in my household.
Sometimes it's easier as a leader of a house that if someone else would make the decision. I don't want to make that decision. Sometimes it's hard decisions that we have to make in life. And back to Andrew's point, and he said, as someone that has grown up in the church, someone that this has been his livelihood, this has been his life from day one. It's hard to hold people accountable because sometimes we don't understand what we're accountable for. And I think that's a challenge that the 21st century church faces? What am I accountable for? Now, I am an organizational nut. I will just tell you that. I will preface that. My natural inkling is organizational structure. Because I run a company of 34 people. And if my 34 people don't know what they're supposed to do, then it's hard for us to be effective. It's hard for us to be successful. And I wonder, would the 21st century church benefit from a little bit more? I don't have the answer. It's a curiosity question. I don't know. I don't know the answer. If we had some clear expectations, would it increase activity? Would it increase closeness? Would it increase camaraderie? And would it increase effectiveness?
I'd like to take an example from many years ago. Allison and I don't remember, this has been a long time. We were at a pitch-in, a potluck, whatever you call it. There was one young child who went through the entire line, and there's every food group imaginable and some I never even thought of spread on this table. And the child selects Cheetos and fills the plate with Cheetos. And I think someone made the comment about being hungry. And the child said, "Yeah, I'm starved," and ate a plate of Cheetos. And it was later that my wife relates this story to me, and she says, "Yeah, this child is starved because he's making a meal out of puffed corn or whatever that stuff is that's been processed. It's not any good for him. It doesn't offer any nutrition." I think the analogy of the body that we understand, where each one is connected and feels the pain of the other, and each one feels for the other, and each part of the body is looking out for the best of the other. That was a missed opportunity from a physical standpoint to intervene in that young child's life and see that they get better nutrition. Over the years, it became evident that was not the only problem in this household. And this person has grown to be someone who is often confused and troubled and hasn't really made great direction or choices for themselves. So how do we say, if the hand cannot say to the eye, because you don't do the function I do, you're not any value? How do we connect those body parts, as Dan says, in an organic way? And as Andrew says, where's our authority? Our authority is we are one body in Christ. Now, how do we make application to that principle we all agree upon? And the argument's been made, if you see it, you do something about it. And that's a biblical model. So if we have those who are struggling and those who see themselves as stronger, the ones who see themselves as stronger should be intervening and stepping in to help, not to punish or to shame, but to help those who are weaker. So if there's to be any corporate culture change, it might be admonishing those who think they're stronger, who are acting like the weak, because we're not engaging with those that we see that have problems. We can't expect the weak to ask for help. This young child who was eating Cheetos didn't know how to ask for nutritional guidance. And we then ponder and wonder why it is this child is starving. And so we need to maybe, from an organizational standpoint, or from a oversight standpoint and accountability, flip it on its ear and say the ones who need to be held accountable are the ones who are mature and strong and have the ability and are not reaching out to the weaker members and encouraging and strengthening and building and mentoring and developing, because they don't know what to ask for. You know, Benjamin's got a young child in his household. Andrew and Addie have got a young child in their house, so they're deciding what they eat. They decide what they wear. They decide when they burp. They decide when they go to bed. They decide all these things for them, and yet it feels like the little person is the one in charge in the household because they're calling all the shots. But they don't know what to ask for. They cry, and then you start the process of elimination. Is it a wet diaper? Is it a burp? Is it a gas? Is it, I need to eat? And as those who, again, consider ourselves as the stronger, more mature members, maybe we're the ones that need to have the eye on us so as to take care of the babes instead of waiting for the babies to ask for help. That might be one way to approach it that could be more effective, because the babies don't, they just cry. They just say, I'm hungry, but they don't have a solution.
But here's the one point, and back to Dan's point, is this should be an organic process. It should just be natural. But I have to ask the hard question. What do we do as our young people walk away from the church? What do we do as members walk away from the church? When members quit attending, what do we do towards them? What do we do with them? How do we make sure that they truly understand how their activities are going to affect their eternal destiny? And I have a concern that it is a lot of inactivity. Because I've heard from people over the years. Yeah, I hadn't been there in 3 months, and 2 people reached out to me. And they were my 2 closest people that I would have expected. We have developed a culture in the first century church of just allowing people to, you know, we have these secret laws that truly we're not as connected as, I don't believe we're as connected as the first century church was, which is why when you look at this study, Committed to Spiritual Growth, how do we foster, how do we build those connections, those deep relationships? How do we build that community that we truly are connected to one another? That we truly know this is my responsibility to my tribe. So that's really what this is. This is a tribe. This is a tribe of people that gather together on 25th Street on a regular basis for one common goal. Get to heaven with as many people with us as we can. That's who we are. And so as this tribe, as this community of people, how do we get tightly connected? And that's what it goes back to. Because sometimes it's hard to hold people accountable. And that was the question that we started with. I really appreciate the conversation.
So, excuse me, to answer your question, Aaron, of how do we get tightly connected? Well, if you have the mindset, okay, that you only meet here 3 times a week, twice on Sunday, once on Wednesday, and that's it, you're not going to get connected that way. You're not going to get a deeper connection with that kind of mindset. You have to have the mindset of, you know, reaching out during the week to different people. And that's how you build closer relationships. You find out what you like to do in common. You find out, you know, just making an effort to reach out and get to know people, not just when we're here, but outside of here as well.
I also think it's important that we develop those relationships pre-crisis mode. And, you said we're so good at jumping in when there's a crisis. I would just make, I don't know, a side note to that I think that there are some crises that we're really good at jumping in at, and there are others that we're uncomfortable with that we don't jump in as quickly. But, if we develop those relationships pre-crisis, then, I mean, people are a lot more likely to come to us. How you treat people, determines if they're going to come to you when they're in crisis. If you treat them badly pre-crisis, don't expect them to come to you. They're not going to. So pre-crisis is huge. We need to focus on that.
You use the term tribe. I use the term family. In everything that we see throughout the Bible, it's a family setting. And I think once we grab that family setting and we treat one another as family, it's a lot harder to leave. It's a lot harder to not see someone having issues and not go to them. If I see one of my daughters have an issue, I immediately go to them. As a female in this congregation, I'm a mom to some. I'm a sister to others. There are people in here that are grandmas because they're older, aunts. If we look at our relationships with one another in that way, that's what builds that camaraderie. That's what builds the family. We have to look at one another as family, because when we're family, we don't want to lose one another. We love one another. We care for one another. We're there for one another. And if we, just like Samantha said, if we sit here and we say we only have to be together 3 times a week, I don't want to see my kids only 3 times a week. I want to see them as much as possible. So if I look at each person in this building the same way, the way to do that is get together, have them over, go to their house, visit with them, do stuff together. That's how you build relationships. That's how we build one another up. And that's how we become, I think, what we saw in the first century. They were always together. They were always doing things. And if we don't do that, then we're just a separate people that come together into a building for a few hours a week. And there's nothing there.
Kind of going off of that, last night, our family all went to dinner and we were talking in the car up to Greenwood, and a situation had happened where somebody was at Emily's house and didn't tell her that they were at Emily's house, and she was like, well, if you would have just told me, you could have come in. And sometimes we're so afraid of bothering somebody, even though this was like a relative that we don't see very often. It'd be nice to see them and show them around, and we're so afraid of inconveniencing somebody. Oh, well, I don't want to make them uncomfortable. Oh, well, they might be busy. Oh, well, they said no that one time, so they probably don't want to go together. But that's not true. Like, we have to want to spend time together and want to have that relationship so that it's not weird to show up at somebody's house and knock and say, here, I brought you cookies. Or, hey, text somebody, do you want to go to the sporting events with me? Or do you want to go to a singing up in Traders Point or whatever?
We got about 1 minute left. Great conversation. And I really think if you took the time to say, what is our responsibility? So one thing I want to point out, on page 31, it says we need to realize that we are going to be held accountable for the way we handled our responsibility. Do we have a responsibility? One more comment. Real quick.
To identify with each other, to associate with each other, And we need to be the person that goes, but we also need to be the gracious recipient. And that's where it gets a little harder. It's much easier sometimes to give than it is to receive. And the same thing applies to, do you want to do this with me? That sort of thing. So it's an excellent point, and it works two ways.
Because sometimes it's easy to always say no. Hey, do you want to do this? No, not really. No, not really. And sometimes we need to train ourselves to stop and say, you know what, I would like to do that. But we're going to be held accountable by God for our responsibility. And what I think we came up with today is our number one responsibility, the thing that we're going to be held accountable for, is am I developing relationships inside of my family, inside of this group that I've chosen to assemble with, to connect myself to? Am I building relationships that A, encourage others, encourage myself, and some people will naturally develop themselves. Some people would like help. So we have to identify, who am I? But I have a responsibility to develop relationships, to encourage one another, and to reach out and maybe tell somebody, I see trouble in your life. Here's something I'd like to talk to you about. So when we get into chapter 5, talks about I feel threatened. How do we reach into others' lives? How do we start getting connected? How do we start building these relationships and dealing with sometimes it's uncomfortable, but sometimes it's very good. So I'm going to look at both of these. How do we build great relationships? And then how do we deal with the fact that sometimes we have to have uncomfortable discussions? Appreciate the conversation. Appreciate the talk. Appreciate the interaction. And we will continue on